I'd like to zero in though. So I didn't completely dodge your question, but I just very briefly answer because I want to zero in on the question of God's body. So I mean, in Islam, there's a lot of, let's say, I shouldn't say in Islam, in popular discourse on Islam today, let's say online, there's a lot of talk about, the God of the Quran is not like the God of the Bible because he's transcendent. And no, people will really emphasize the importance of the verse that says there is nothing like him. And so God is transcendent. And so I think your argument about God's body was like a shock, like does this guy not really know that the God of the Quran is transcendent? Like, how could he does he not know that all of this language sitting on the throne is just symbolic? Yeah, what's your response to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't really expect myself to expect to find myself the center of a controversy there, because most of those ideas, I remember I gave a talk at ICSA, but the last year before the pandemic, must have been 2019, where I went through all of that, and there was no excitement at all in the audience. So I thought, okay, this is good to go then. I put it into the dictionary. I don't know, maybe one thing to stress is that I'm not out to show that the Quran has a view of God that is simplistic or sort of non-spiritual. So that is how somebody like Hubert Grimmer tackles the topic, right? So that's kind of the usual Orientalist, if you want to call it that, dismissal of the Quran, where people maybe don't go through the exercise of trying to see whether there's more to it. I don't know. It seems to me that if you go through the Quran, there's quite a bit of language that implies that God is a person, obviously, like humans, and that also that the Quran is assuming that persons are embodied beings. So I think the Quran has an embodied notion of personhood, where persons are bodily mental wholes rather than sort of conglomerates of a mind and a body that are just sort of tenuously connected. And actually, that is something that Fazlur Rahman, I think, very admirably spells out. So I think that is a major insight, that when the Quran says nafs, do not read that as a platonic soul that could, in theory, exist in a sort of disembodied state. It means something else. So I think there's language in the Quran that implies a general notion of personhood as embodied, and also that implies that God has certain corporeal features. He seems to sometimes move around. He seems to have hands, a face, and eyes. He seems to
Adam with his two hands.
His hands, yeah. He moves
with the angels, and
exactly, yes, yeah. He moves into the world at the end of the world. Now, I think I would accept a figurative reading of that, maybe under two conditions, right? So the first condition would be that the Quran, or any text for that matter, is credibly taken to have an implicit ontology that allows for entities that are not material, that are incorporeal, or basically a Platonizing ontology where you've got sort of two domains of being, the material world, and then some sort of intellectual world. So Avicenna has that ontology. Al-Farabi has that ontology. I'm not sure that the Quran does. I see no explicit warrant for the assumption that the Quran has that sort of two-domain ontology. So that would be the first condition. Yeah.
Can I jump in just on that?
Yeah.
Is that because we have these passages where, in terms of cosmology, the Quran seems to teach that God and the Mela, what is it sometimes called, the heavenly council,
is
yes. Basically on the other side of the fixed stars, so we're all existing in one cosmos.
Yeah, I mean, so the Quran, I think the Quranic term for the cosmos is the heavens and the earth and what is between them. I mean, that is kind of, I guess, the most comprehensive word that the Quran has for kind of the world. It doesn't talk about corporeal and incorporeal entities. I mean, one can in Arabic. So you get that sort of fairly early on in the 8th century, Jahm ibn Safwan, whom you'll know, he's sort of on record. I mean, this is via, I think, Ash'ari's maqalat, but he's on record as saying something like that God is ghayrul jism. God is not a body. But language like that is completely alien to the Quran. It's not in the Quran. We do get the distinction between al-ghaib and al-shahada, and so I do have an entry on that too. I don't think that means material and immaterial existence.
The demons and the jinn are trying to get up there past the barrier, right? And being blocked, and I mean,
so
the idea that they could potentially, and I guess the angels do, penetrate into the heavenly realm where God and the council is found. I don't know if you think along those lines about how cosmology is linked to personhood or embodiment of God.
No, I think if you have an embodied sense of personhood, that it means that a person is an entity in space, also an entity that has certain features. For instance, a face, like a person is an entity that you can face, countenance. So I find it actually, it's an intriguing take on the concept of personhood. So I would actually, rather than saying, oh, the Quran has, maybe a view of the deity that is slightly embarrassingly physical, I'd celebrate this as a very interesting philosophical take on personhood. And I would say that actually, I find it much more interesting than the tired old Platonic assumption that, oh yes, there's immaterial existence. Nobody knows how to kind of explicate how that might interact with kind of the material sphere of being. But somehow there's an instinct that we have in reading the Quran, which I think I had too, and which I've tried to overcome, to assume that if you have a properly sophisticated and lofty conception of the deity, then that will involve an immaterial deity. So I think that's just a medieval Platonic legacy. I think we need to, for various theological and philosophical reasons, I mean, I'm not a committed theist, you might say, but if I were one, I think I could rattle off a long list of reasons why maybe you would be well advised to question that. I don't think that that's the way to give a rational account of any version of theism today. I think, and maybe that's another flourish, but there's a certain maybe anxiety among believers of kind of all persuasions, Jews, Christians, Muslims, sometimes sort of live up to this implicit assumption of kind of Enlightenment standards of rationality. And one of the, as it were, sort of entry tickets for that, I think, is often felt to be, oh, you need to have an immaterialist conception of God. Otherwise, you really can't claim that your form of theism is sort of intellectually respectable. And I think all of that probably needs to be rethought. I think there's people who are doing that. I think it's done in biblical studies, and I think the Quran is kind of ripe for the plucking there.
And you're not. So we should maybe transition, because there are lots of interesting questions coming up. But,
sorry, could I just say my second condition for
okay.
So I'm not. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I think. A lot of what the Quran says about God's face and hands, I mean, there is an idiomatic purport to that. The Quran is certainly very short on concrete descriptive detail. I think the Quran presents a very sort of culled and carefully curated selection of anthropomorphic or maybe prosopomorphic sort of person-like features of God. And I think that selectivity is important. So I think you could it wouldn't be entirely implausible to say maybe some of that or all of that should be read figuratively. But again, the reason why I find overall it more plausible to sort of not do that, to not take recourse to the kind of metaphorical reading, which is instinctual in certain regards, is firstly because I don't see the Quran's implicit ontology as allowing any being to be exclusively immaterial, and secondly because what we don't get in the Quran, and this is where we do get, I think, into various verses and sort of concrete exegetical questions, I don't think the Quran gives us a sort of disclaimers of corporeal language that we get, for instance, in Christian authors like Ephraim, for instance, who might say, "Oh God, just out of His goodness, He took on images, and He, in order to be understandable." So those disclaimers I don't see in the Quran. I think all of this "Laysa kamithlihi shay," etc. verses, like the small number of verses that have been interpreted in that way, I think you can plausibly read differently. So the God is unlike "Laysa kamithlihi shay," that verse, I think that talks about creation. In my view, if you look at the entire verse, it talks about God as being the only being who's capable of creating. Others aren't. That's a big
Quran
difference.
42:11.
So the Quran certainly has a notion of divine transcendence, of God being other than humans, radically other in certain ways. But I think in the Quran, it's tied to creation and creative powers. It's not given an ontological spin. So God's alterity doesn't consist in the fact that he's ontologically constituted differently. So I think that's a very sort of Greek projection onto the Quran.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense to me. So as a second point after the immaterial point, or the absence of a clear differentiation between an immaterial being in the Quran. But I just want to read Quran 42:11. It famously has laysa kamithlihi shay, which means nothing like him. Just to maybe underline Professor Sinai's point, the originator of the heavens and the earth, he made for you mates from your own selves and mates of the cattle, an'am, Arabic word is an'am, by which he multiplies you, and then nothing is like him, and he is the all-hearing, the all-seeing. So, I mean, that's the point there about there's contrast being made to humans multiplying through, relations, mates, all that thing, which God doesn't do, and it's not material versus unmaterial that's at stake.
Yeah. Sorry, could just because that verse is so fascinating, maybe we'll get more takes on that. But so it's one of Ibn Arabi's favorite ones, right? Because you've got laysa kamithlihi shay'un wa huwa as-sami'ul basir. So Ibn Arabi, obviously, he likes paradoxes. So he really does drive home the fact that you have divine alterity next to divine similarity, as-sami' al-basir. Yeah, because those are two attributes that God would share with humans. So you get tanzih and tashbih next to each other. And Ibn Arabi, of course, he goes on and on. You need to sort of hold those two things in balance. And I think that's actually very true for the Quran. So I think the Quran does both. The Quran certainly does stress divine transcendence, but the Quran also talks about various things that God has in common with humans. And I think that's kind of crucial to the whole worldview of the Quran. You need to hold those things in balance.
In Al-Najm, where it says, are you saying that God has female offspring while you have male offspring? Would any of you like something like that? There's some kind of appeal to what humans naturally like, namely male offspring, and you sort of implemented for the argument of how would you imagine that God would like to have female offspring? Anyway, I just thought of that point.
Question we have here is from Nuri Sunnah. So he mentions that Clement of Alexandria speaks of angels present before the throne, suggesting its materiality. It also denies God's literal enthronement. Can we think of the Quran doing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, if the Quran were literally denying God's literal enthronement, then yes, I'd be open to that. But that's I guess the second condition that I referred to earlier. I just don't see the Quran as saying things like, so Ephraim in one place, I think in the Carmina Nisibena, he said, oh, God looks without eyes, he creates without hands, he hears without an ear. Elsewhere he says things like, oh, you must not turn God into a body, Gashem, right? So he basically says, don't do tajsim, which is a fairly abstract sort of ontological, I think, warning. I just don't see the Quran having those statements. If the Quran did have them, then I'd be open to this reading. But I suppose we would then argue about laysa kamithlihi shay and this other verse in Surah 6, the eyes do not attain him, but he attains the eyes.
Yeah. So, I mean, another way of saying this is the Quran is not worried that it doesn't sort of say, listen to its audience, please be sure you don't take this as anthropomorphic. Please do not misunderstand. Like, there's no statement like that. Like an extra little, not caveat, but sort of extra bit in order to make sure the audience is not taking this as anthropomorphic or embodiment.
Could I just maybe to tie that back to the question of charity, right? So again, the Hubert Grimmer take. I mean, impressive scholar, and I like German Orientalists, so I don't want to be bashing them, but he would say, the Quran is just kind of a bit, childish there, because it hasn't yet attained a properly spiritual notion of the deity. So I think there's a more charitable way of reading the Quran here as doing something theologically interesting and worthwhile, and maybe I suppose the way I would frame it if I were doing theology myself is that so first they come for God's body, then they come for God's personhood, and in the end they come for God as an entity that's distinct from other entities in the world. So you could argue that there's a very long slippery slope here that that leads from denying God's body to ultimately denying that God is separate from the world in Spinoza. And it seems to me that you might as well want to fight that battle with God's body rather than say, okay, well, he doesn't have a body, but he still has a personality and he is a distinct being in the world. I think there's a good philosophical argument to be made that if you, it's very difficult to understand sort of personhood without embodiedness. And so I think you are on that slippery slope. So I'd fight that battle earlier.